Good evening, and welcome to the Museum of Science. I'm Lisa Monrose, producer of the Brainiac series, and tonight we're excited to present our program in collaboration with the museum's Forum Initiative. During the first half of the program, you'll hear from experts. During the second half, you'll have a chance to consider and voice your own thoughts about the issues presented. We hope you'll find this an interesting experience. The Mattatuck Museum Arts and History Center in Waterbury, Connecticut, provides the jumping-off point for this program and a perfect example of the issues involved with the use of human remains for education and display. Please join me in welcoming the Mattatuck Museum's Executive Director, Marie Galbraith, and the Chair of their African American History Project, Maxine Watts.
Thank you very much. The Mattatuck Museum has been working with the African American History Project Committee since 1996, when Maxine Watts went to research the history of the Pearl Street Neighborhood House, which was founded in the 1920s and was the community cultural center for children and adults, and found that the histories had been thrown away. They'd been taken home by people involved in the project, and you know how those records disappear when people move or die. And Maxine called me and said, we need a history project. And these 8 women and 1 man have been working together for the last 10 years to recover the history of the African American community in Waterbury. And Maxine will tell you about the Fortune Project, but I want to just let you know that there were many projects that preceded the Fortune Project. They first interviewed the elders in Waterbury, hired a playwright, and who wrote a play called Reflections, Front Porch Stories, about the people who were interviewed, and they were in the audience watching the play, and I'm pleased to say that they were all very excited and that their stories were being told, and they felt told faithfully. The committee then went on to make a video called Common Threads, which depicted the stories of the people who came to Waterbury in the 1920s from the South, mostly from Gates County, North Carolina, and built a community in Waterbury. And then came Fortune, and Maxine will tell you about the Fortune Project. But I just want to tell you about the museum's acquiring of this skeleton and a little bit about his history. We have in our remains the custody of an African-American captive named Fortune, who was enslaved in the late 1700s in the household of Dr. Preserve Porter, a physician who specialized in bone setting. The only written account of Fortune's death in 1798 and Porter's subsequent use of his bones is described in Anderson's History of Waterbury, published in 1896. Quote, "On the west side of the river is a steep rock sloping into the river with deep water at the bottom, known as Larry's Rock. Larry was a slave belonging to Dr. Preserve Porter, and either by accident or through some pique, he slipped or was drowned. With true professional instinct and an eye to economy, Dr. Porter prepared and preserved his skeleton, doing the work, it is said, at the place where the accident occurred. The skeleton was a school of anatomy for the town and has been in existence until a recent period and may be yet." Now, this heavily prejudiced tale took on an air of authority for much of the 20th century. This is an image of Fortune that was made by William Westwood, a medical illustrator, based on Fortune's skeleton. By 1896, Fortune's identity had been lost. The name Larry had been written in his skull sometime in the 19th century. Anderson implies that Larry caused his own death through carelessness or temper. And Anderson is also admires the quickness of mind and of Dr. Porter, who seized upon this opportunity to use Fortune's bones for a practical purpose. The bones were passed down through the Porter family, and in 1933, Fortune's remains were donated to the museum by Porter's great-granddaughter, Dr. Sally McGlannon Law. Now, Fortune was listed as a group of 5 slaves in Porter's household in the 1790 federal census. He and his wife were living in Waterbury, and their son Jacob, and they had 4 other children. They had 2 daughters, Myra, born in 1789, and Roxa, born in 1791. The dates of their birth were recorded in the town records by Dr. Porter. A Connecticut law passed in 1788 required slave owners to record the birth of every child of their slaves in order to help guarantee their gradual emancipation under the law passed in 1784. He had an older son, Africa, whose name was also recorded in the tax records of Waterbury. But he was born in September 1772, and he was not born in Waterbury. And he was also eligible for emancipation under the 1784 law. We don't know where Africa was born. What kind of work did Fortune do? Dr. Porter owned a 75-acre farm in Waterbury, and he also was a medical doctor. So I've heard that in order to acquire wealth, you should have more than one source of income. And certainly that's what Fortune did for Dr. Porter. This property, 75 acres, was more than enough to sustain the household of Dr. Porter, and the agricultural surplus could then be sold off. Dinah and Fortune's children worked on the farm as well, and Dinah, of course, would have worked in the household. This is a map of Waterbury, and Fortune's homestead was part of on the property of Dr. Porter, and Porter produced rye, Indian corn, onions, potatoes, apple, beef, hogs, cider, hay, oats, and buckwheat. How did Fortune die? One of the reasons that we undertook this project was because we had this remains of Fortune in the museum since 1938, and really there was nothing we could do with Fortune. We couldn't tell his story because we didn't know it, and we couldn't bury him because we didn't know how to bury him. We didn't know who he was. We didn't know where he came from. We didn't know what kind of ritual burial would be appropriate for Fortune. The cause of his death is still a mystery. When we went to work with the scientists, we thought science will have the answers. We will know how Fortune died. But in fact, the scientists are not in agreement as to the cause of Fortune's death, but we do know that his vertebrae at the top of his spinal column was broken, but the anthropologists believe that that was not the result of hanging. And there is damage to other bones. He was injured in his work. His bones were broken on his foot. His hand bones were broken. His back was broken at the spine, and really just healed without treatment. Porter had Fortune baptized, or Fortune wished to be baptized, we don't know, into the Episcopal Church on December 20th, 1797. He died in 1798. There's no month or day given for his death. He may have died 2 weeks after his baptism or a year after his baptism. Why wasn't Fortune buried? As a slave, he was considered Porter's property, and so was allowed to use Fortune's bones for medical purposes. And he was a bone setter, a fourth-generation bone setter, so he would have been very interested in studying human anatomy. And he prepared his Fortune's skeleton and opened a school for anatomy. He didn't have a shingle hanging on the door, but people knew that that rarity and anatomy to study what could be found at Dr. Porter's practice. So local doctors were able to go and learn human anatomy. And you can see here Fortune's scapula, and you can see his skull, and you can see the writing, the script, the identification of the bones. On the right side of this image is an anatomy notebook of 1780. It's called The Art of Dissecting the Parts of a Human Body, and it is in our collection, but we don't know if Dr. Porter wrote this. Fortune's bones came to the museum through the descendants of Dr. Porter. They were donated to the museum in 1933, and Dr. McGlannon wrote of receiving her first medical instruction as a child when her father taught the names of the bones using Fortune's skeleton, just as the Porters were taught in the ages before. Generations of museum visitors remember Larry the skeleton.
The skeleton is very much like a map of your life, from the formation of your teeth all the way to looking for causes of death.
You see in these muscle attachment areas that these were very robust and actually working hard. The kind of wear and then the attachments really indicates that it was a really sort of continuous, long life of arduous labor.
These are some of the examinations by the anthropologists and archaeologists who worked on the New York Burial Ground project. It was important for the museum to undertake this project, and we couldn't have done it without the African American History Project Committee, because Fortune is really part of the collective unconscious of Waterbury. Everyone remembers him, and the stories are passed down of the class trips to the museum. The local newspapers published anecdotes down through the years, with each story adding another layer of myth to Fortune's life. Fabulous tales told of the friction between Porter and Larry, a friction so strong that Larry ran away with Porter in pursuit, chasing him down to the river to see him overcome by the current. The skeleton was removed from display in 1970, and that seemed to be the end of the story, except that the African American History Project was with us, and we were able to pursue this study. We asked ourselves a number of questions. How should or could the museum construct the project to recover Fortune's story such that it did not exploit him again? Who would research the historical record? Who would examine Fortune's bones? Who would interpret the findings? Who would believe it? And can this project help us to understand ourselves and our past? And can it help us to overcome bias and prejudice? We worked with the anthropologists, as I said, archaeologists from the New York Burial Ground Project, Frank Mitchell, an African-American who's a historian who has done a number of public history projects in Connecticut. And these are some of their comments on Fortune and his bones and what they reveal to us.
We want to find out who he really is. He is not only Fortune, he is somebody's father. He's somebody's grandson. Two of the most important aspects for us is extracting both bone and teeth for chemical analysis, but also for DNA analysis. What we want to find out is, where did he come from? Remember that the teeth develop when you're a child. It will have a chemical signature of where you've been. But just as importantly is finding out who he is related to biologically, and that's what the DNA will show us.
And this is Frank Bender.
When I first saw Fortune's skull, I said, wow, what an interesting subject.
Frank Bender is just the perfect person to reconstruct the face of Mr. Fortune. He does use scientific methodology, and that's important to make sure you get the right measurements.
I want to give them my all, and I think they deserve the utmost in time and respect.
And this is the image of Fortune created by Frank Bender. To construct this project and to answer the questions and to do it with a sense of community, to respond to the community, and to do the project at all, we turned to Maxine Watts and the African American History Project Committee, and Maxine will tell you about their reaction to the prospect of undertaking this. Maxine?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to share with our committee what we went through when we came upon this African American slave who was the skeleton that hung up in the museum for all those many years. And I do believe that most of the community probably thought it was a plastic skeleton. And so it came to our attention that it was really, truly an African American slave. And that is what we were looking for in our project, to try to find the history of the oldest African American in Waterbury. And when we heard about this slave, we knew that we had to take him on as our project. And even though he couldn't speak for himself, we decided to do our investigation and find out a little bit about his life. Some of the things I'll be saying will be repetitions of what Marie just told you, but anyway, we did have a deep discussion with our committee whether we should really reveal to the public that the skeleton was indeed a slave living in Waterbury, because most people didn't believe that Waterbury even had any slaves. And then we also found out that through the document, the city document, how Dr. Porter acquired this slave and, eventually took his bones and boiled them and then marked them and used them for his medical students. So we wanted to we had a heavy-duty discussion as to whether we should let sleeping dogs lie and let the story stay where it is, or whether we should let the community know just what this story was all about. So the community did decide, after much discussion, we decided that this history of slavery should be told, and that we should take this skeleton and investigate the condition of the skeleton. And also, since we're doing this, we felt that we should become responsible caretakers of one of our ancestors. So once we started investigating the history of Waterbury, we found that many prominent citizens were owners of slaves, and how Dr. Porter himself owned the most slaves. He owned 5 of them, as Marie just told you. And that Dr. Porter, though, allowed Fortune to take on a lot of responsibility of his property, and that he owned his own home, and that his wife also had him baptized as an Episcopalian. So we wondered, the committee wondered what deteriorated this relationship. Why did he do this to Fortune? We said, well, perhaps maybe he had too much power. Or perhaps he was starting to get old, and then he didn't want to take on that responsibility, which was the responsibility of slave owners to take care of the old people. So maybe he had poor health. Something happened that deteriorated this relationship, and therefore we decided that this is probably what had happened to Fortune. The committee also was very concerned, and we discussed also the possible emotional impact on the Porter family, on the Fortune family, and we wanted to we discussed whether his wife Dinah whether she knew that the skeleton was her husband. We also wondered if the slave community, whether they wondered what ever happened to Fortune. And then we also wondered that if Dinah did think this was her husband, why did she not have the courage, like other slaves in her time frame, to run away? We figured that she must have been afraid. In the history of Waterbury during that time, we looked up, we found out there was a Joseph Munn who went to war. He was promised his freedom, and while he was at war, he was sold, and he came back, and he petitioned the court for 5 years, trying to get his freedom. And then there was a Dan Cambridge, who was a free man in that community at that time. There was a Comfort Homer, a female who was denied her freedom when she was emancipated, and she petitioned the court and finally won her freedom. And then there was a Cuff Capenny, who went to war, and he was a rich slave and left money for some other slaves to buy their freedoms. So these were slaves in that little community there in Waterbury that were very aggressive for their rights and were very successful. So we said, then why did Dinah stay? You know, why didn't she run? So perhaps she was afraid. Maybe she thought the same thing would happen to her would happen to Fortune. You know, we also, after that, we also wanted to see what different professional people thought of that skeleton. And that's when, in fact, Marie just showed you that, how we had Frank Bender take a skull, and he was a forensic artist, and he constructed his face and his hands. And then Mark Mack from Howard University came to Waterbury. Warren Perry knew that he was involved with the burial grounds there in New York. So he came to Waterbury, and he really looked over the committee to see that we were really serious about this. And he decided not to ship the skeleton down to Howard, but he brought Fortune down in his car so they wouldn't get damaged. And then he invited some of the committee to come down and find out what he and his students observed from that skeleton. The first thing they did when I went down to Howard, and another person from our committee and one of the curators from the museum accompanied us. And we went down there, and the first thing that the students did in Howard, that they were very emotional about this skeleton. They took him as one of their ancestors. The first thing they did was wash his bones, wiped the name Larry off of his forehead, and then compared his condition with the bones of a lot of the slaves that were taken out of that New York burial ground. We found that since Fortune had been boiled, his bones were very clean. In comparison to those bones that were taken, they were in the drawers, and they showed us how some of them died from carrying those heavy weights on their head. And a lot of the bones were not clean. They were just deteriorated from the ground. So there was a big difference in the condition of the bones. Some that were oily and smelly and so forth. So there was a big difference between Fortune's bones, who had never been in the ground, and the bones that were taken from the New York burial ground. At this time, all those bones, by the way, had been buried. Then we also had Leslie Rakin Hill. We sent the bones there to the University of Oklahoma, and she identified the bones in lower back that were broken, and 3 toes, and right foot and finger. Warren Perry, by the way, all these professional people, we decided to have African Americans involved in this project so that we could feel that they had a feeling, an emotional feeling towards the skeleton, and that we would get a true examination and true feeling of what they really found with the skeleton. Warren Perry has been working with us for quite some time, even did a lecture for us with our community. He examined the skeleton and revealed evidence on the bones to show that Fortune might have had a skin disease tracing back to Africa. So the committee then decided that the Fortune story should be shared with the public. We approached Marilyn Nelson, Poet Laureate of Connecticut, to interpret the materials that we presented to her, that we compiled on Fortune, and she presented us with the Manumission Requiem, all about fortune, and she has since published a book and so forth. I'm sure you'll hear about that in a very short while. After this, the committee, right now, this is where we stand with the Fortune project, that we will be undertaking a survey of public opinion as to the future of fortune. The committee right now is divided at this point as to whether to continue educational and more scientific analysis to further understand our African American history, or some of the committee feel enough is enough and to put his body to rest. So that is where we stand. Before I finish, I would like to introduce one of our committee members that happens to be with us tonight, which is right here, Audrey Harrell. And so that's where we stand right now in our Fortune project. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine, and thank you, Marie. That was fascinating. Leaving Fortune for a moment, we turn now to bioethicist George Annis from the Boston University School of Public Health. George will introduce us to other situations that raise ethical questions concerning the use of human remains.
All right. Thank you for talking about fortune. I mean, that fortune really, in one skeleton, encapsulates most of the issues I'm going to talk about from a broader perspective. Issues of power, issues of property, issues of race, not gender, but we're going to bring up gender, and issues of respect, what we mean by respect for the dead. This is a hot subject. Right? It's not just the show here and the many body shows around the United States and around the world, but there seems to be a renewed fascination with death, with dead bodies, and with commerce in dead bodies. And all of these books I could definitely commend to you, and they all come at it from different perspectives, and they all, I think, evidence our current, again, fascination with death, something that both repels us and attracts us at the same time. This is the Kennewick Man. We were talking about that before tonight. One of the most famous skeletons remains in the United States, became a cause célèbre, a big battle between Native Americans and Smithsonian and scientists who want to study him, and Native Americans who wanted to bury him. And we also had a forensic artist construct his face. Probably not as good as Fortune's artist, but that's the reconstruction of Kennewick Man's face. A lot of people thought if you go on the internet, it looked a lot like Captain Picard. So he was. Turns out he was a French guy after all, not a Native American. We'll come back to that. One issue that seems clear to me is that the older a skeleton is, the more we can treat it like a thing. The more we can treat it like an object of science. So fossils, this is Lucy, we just discovered a year ago and just published in Nature, is 3.5 million years old. A prototype, not human, she's a primate, but close to human. And no one suggested that we should rebury her. She's an object of science. All right? Mummies have become objects of science, even though they're much more recent than she, just a few thousand years old. Fortune is not, obviously, can be considered an object of science. Not old enough yet. So that's one thing I think that we can talk about, but whether time matters. I mentioned before, it's not just fortune, that race matters too. in a recent book, which I'll talk about in a second, talks about the history of Tanzania and the British in Tanzania trying to respond to their colleagues' request to find skeletons of Aborigines in Tanzania to send back to England for their comparative skeleton collection, and how these were obtained. I mean, that was, like the least of the problems of the Aboriginals in Tanzania, who were literally wiped out by the whites at the time. Museums also contain skeletal remains all around the country. This is a museum in Philadelphia, the Mutter Museum, very famous museum. There's a lot of very weird stuff in it, but it's all relatively old. It's all, all more than 100 years old, most of these curiosities. It was originally, as were most skeletons, originally designed just to be seen by physicians and medical students. That museum wasn't open to the public. More recently, it's become open to the public. And we want to ask that question, too. Are dissections and remains the provenance of scientists and physicians, or should we democratize it and let everybody in on the story? The Tanzania story is told by Helen MacDonald in her book Human Remains, which got an incredible review in the New York Times a couple weeks ago. Some of you may have seen. So it caused me to buy it. It's a very, very interesting book about that. But she also writes about the British experience with dead bodies. And in Britain, the only people that could be dissected in the 1900s, in the 19th century, in the 1800s, were people who had been executed. You executed someone, that was a public event, and you gave the body to the surgeon. That was a private event, and they dissected it. You know the story of Burke and Hare and what changed the laws in England. Burke and Hare were people who procured bodies for physicians to study, and they got carried away and started killing people instead of just getting dead bodies. And this is one of the women they killed, Mary Patterson. And a very bizarre episode that Helen MacDonald recounts in this book is that this woman is dead. Her body was brought to the surgeon, and the surgeon thought she was so beautiful, or for whatever reason, he immediately got a portrait painter to come paint her portrait, and he formed her body in that position, which, if you look at it closely, is a position you couldn't stand for very long. And he became so enamored of this body that after that, he put it in a vat of whiskey and kept it there for 3 months before he actually dissected it. And it just raised question in Helen MacDonald's mind, and maybe raised question in your minds. What are these men doing with these women's bodies? And is this science, or is this voyeurism, or is this something else going on? And there's a whole history of that. In literature, this has been discussed in detail. Elizabeth Bronfen, probably one of the best-known books on the subject of dead women in literature. It's not just in dissection. That dead women have a fascination for artists, for painters, for storytellers, Edgar Allan Poe, of course, and others. And what Elizabeth writes, she makes two very striking sentences, which I didn't memorize, so I'll read for you. She says, and you can decide whether you agree with her or not, says, by embalming a beautiful woman, she is idealized in a way that obscures the possibility of decay, and with it the possibility of the survivor's death, your own death. She also says, similarly, that a beautiful feminine corpse exemplifies to perfection how the object of desire is never real, but rather the symptom of the lover's fantasy. That's probably true, whether in life or in death. But we do have a fascination for embalmed bodies, maybe especially embalmed women's bodies, because we think that can somehow arrest decay. And we do think that. And also that maybe we're never going to have to die ourselves. So that has this poetic fascination. In body worlds, decay has stopped. Never happened before in the history of the world. So we've got to wonder, what does that means something, obviously. Take the water, the moisture out of the muscles and bones, replace it with a plasticizer, and von Huygens says, well, they'll live forever. They're not going to live preserve forever. But then he says thousands of years, and that could be true. Long time. Something's changed here. And what's changed is in real human bodies, not in plastic. So I'll suggest later, if these were plastic, we wouldn't come and see them. I mean, some people who made plastic models might come and see them, but it wouldn't have the same fascination. The fascination is that these are real people whose water, H2O, has been replaced by plastic. But Elizabeth Bronfman would still say, well, why do you do that? Why do you put a woman, and actually some exhibit goers have said this too, why would you place her in kind of this pinup position? That's obviously not required for science, probably not even required for art. I mean, is it true that most of the women, and you can make this decision yourself, in the display are passive, are laid out kind of in ways that men could dominate? This is the yoga woman from the exhibit, because it's not downstairs, it's right down the hall. And, well, I leave that to you. Why that position? What does that tell us more about the person who put her in that position than about her? This is the artist on a float in Germany in 1990, and it reminds us that he's German. I can't hold that against him, but that Germany and some of the controversy that was raised by the exhibit comes straight out of the Holocaust. And in both trials, we're talking a lot about military commissions in the United States during the last week, unfortunately have decided to strip defendants of a lot of their rights. Nonetheless, when we had the first military commission in Germany, one of the major indictments was for producing the Jewish skeleton collection. The Jewish skeleton collection was a collection that was made for Dr. August Hirt at the Strasbourg Museum. And was also, and this Dr. Hirt here, Dr. Hirt said that he had a fine skeleton collection in his anatomy class. But what he was missing were skeletons of Jewish Bolsheviks, Jews from the Soviet Union. And he said that since it was German policy to eradicate that race, right, that he wanted to have specimens that could be studied over the years by his scientists. So he asked Himmler, and literally true, and you have the request and the answer, for 150 Jewish Bolsheviks in good condition that could be used to make skeletons. And indeed, they were actually rounded up in Auschwitz, sent to another concentration camp, Natzweiler, gassed, and then the body shipped to Dr. Hirt so he could make skeletons out of them. Originally, he said he was just going to use the skulls, but ultimately he decided to use the whole skeleton. Not surprisingly, the problem with that was not using the skeleton. It was killing these people, right? It was murder. But nonetheless, the point was that they were done for scientific purposes. And the judges, both at the large trial and this is a doctor's trial at Nuremberg, condemned all the people involved in that. And indeed, they were hung because they were involved in that. Dr. Hirt himself committed suicide right at the end of the war. The Nuremberg Code, which came out of the Nazi experiments, not necessarily the Jewish skeleton collection, but the Nazi experiments, is something that now has application to dead bodies as well as to live bodies, which is that the voluntary, competent, informed, and understanding consent of the research subject is absolutely required, and research subject should have the right to withdraw at any time. And in thinking about that idea, which is now grown to personal autonomy, part of human dignity, that individuals have the right to make their own decisions, the collection raises that question. The plastinization of bodies raises that question. How far does that go? Can you do anything with your body that other people can do to it? Do you have total rights over your body after death, the way you have it before death, to accept or reject anything? Again, I don't have answers to these questions. I'm just raising them right now. But those are really interesting questions. I mean, this is not Frankenstein, right? Frankenstein tried to take dead body parts and make a live body. Here we're trying to take dead body parts, keep them dead, right? But prevent them from decaying. Prevent them from decaying further. Mold them into a shape that will last forever. There's been debate in a number of exhibits, not this one here, but a number of exhibits about the source of the bodies. There have been allegations in the press, and I haven't been able to confirm it or deny them. Some of the bodies came from Chinese prisons, were executed prisoners, which would be very much in keeping with the history of dissection. Others came from Siberia, from mental institutions there, and prisons there as well. Others were homeless people, people who had no family, people whose bodies weren't claimed. And raises the question, right? Can you use bodies for this purpose, the possessor of which didn't consent to it, right? Just because they have no family. They have no one to look out for them. They have no one to make decisions for them. In the United States, we've become very enamored of using dead bodies for transplants, right? And that's a good purpose, right? We take parts of dead people, who really are dead, and use them to keep other people alive. It's very hard to argue that that's a bad thing. Although recently we've seen a number of scandals, including the Alistair Cook scandal, where people are taking parts of dead bodies without any permission and selling them on the market and using them around. And even the American Society of Tissue Organizations has now recommended self-regulation before we get a statute to try to stem the tide of illegal commerce in organs and tissues, mostly tissues, in the United States. Some people used to argue at the beginning of transplantation that this was like neo-cannibalism, kind of like that, and that you're using live human tissue to keep other people alive. And most people would say it would be better, that transplantation is great, I'm not arguing against it, but it would be better if we had artificial organs like an artificial heart, and that we didn't have to go through this process of taking tissue from dead individuals right after they die. You can argue that, but what I do think is, in the terms of plastinization, I said, well, when I first saw an exhibit, it wasn't this one, it was a different one. I had the reaction that many of my friends have had of being fascinated and horrified at the same time, but being more fascinated than horrified. But I asked the question, if this was just plastic, if this was really plastic, it wasn't a human, it's plastic, would I care? Would anybody care? And I think the answer is no. But I also think more than that. I think that when the day comes, and probably not that far away, where you can make an exhibit like this out of plastic where people can't tell the difference. Is that real human tissue or is that plastic? Then you can't use human tissue anymore. I would make the argument. This is a replicator from Starship Enterprise for you Star Trek fans. The replicator can make anything. I don't know if we have to wait till the 24th century to get a replicator. But someday we're going to be able to make exactly the exhibit here artificially. And then I think you're not going to be able to justify doing that. I'm not sure you can justify doing a public dissection now, but we can certainly talk. We can certainly talk about that. Finally, I think that the complexity of dealing with death is really what is the ultimate fascination with this. Yeah, there's some science there. Yeah, people who've done anatomy and dissected a corpse are really fascinated to see this exhibit because it's so different than you get from a desiccated corpse that most medical students have to work with. And you can learn things from this. There's no question about it. It can be educational. But it's much more than that. And you want to wonder, what do you learn from this? You can learn the science of anatomy, but you also learn something about how you and we feel about dead bodies, what we feel is right to do with them or to them, and what we feel may be close to the line and maybe giving us messages that we don't want. So in conclusion, in summary, what I would say, and this is very tentative. I'm not ready to write about this, but someday I will. I would say that informed consent is necessary but not sufficient. I do think that people who go to the exhibit, spend time in it, think about it, are in a position to give informed consent to have their body plastinated. They've seen it. They've seen what it does. I think that's exactly. If you haven't seen one, I don't think you're in a position to. But number two, unlike human experimentation, things we talked about in Nuremberg, where people can change their mind at any time and walk out, hey, once you're dead, you're out of the ballgame. You can't change your mind. And so you can either say you really, really, really want to do this, or I think it's preferable that someone, obviously the best of someone you appoint, is around to say, that's too much. Yeah, he gave you your permission to plastinate him, but he didn't want him displayed in that particular way. That's really over the line. So I think there should be what I call a post-mortem advocate who has the right to withdraw your consent and say, that's it, we're going to bury, at this point we bury the plastinate. I think we have to define ownership and custody. What does it mean to have one of these? The consent form now says that your body can be, after it's plastinate, can be sold to educational institutions and museums, but not to private parties. Well, why not? What if a billionaire offers, a lot of money? Says, I want that plastinate in my garden or in my yard. What is the nature of the ownership there? Slavery is now a crime against humanity, but it used to be routine for people to own other human beings. As horrible as that is, it used to be routine for people to think that they can do what they want with skeletons. We don't think that way anymore, and we don't know how to think about plastinates. I would say that right now. And also, as I suggested, I think we should define an end point, that once we can make undetectable duplicates artificially, that should be the end of using real bodies for these types of displays. And I want to give some credit to this guy, Barillon, who wrote I'm sure I got lots of ideas from him, who wrote a piece published in Bioethics just 2 weeks ago about body works. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And the plot thickens. Lots of juicy aspects to these questions. To broaden the discussion even further, we will now hear about other cultures' approaches to human bodies after death from cultural anthropologist Ellen Schatzsnyder of Brandeis University.
Thank you. I speak tonight as a cultural anthropologist deeply interested in how human beings across a vast range of cultures, past and present, have understood, used, and displayed human bodies, including corpses of the dead. The physical body may be a natural organism, but the body natural is always twinned intimately with the social body, which is shaped and organized by human-made institutions for good or for ill. In many instances, the public presentation of the remains of the dead can be profoundly moving, beautiful, and even transcendent. Among the Marana people of central Madagascar, for example, bereaved relatives from time to time will exhume the bones of beloved ancestors in order to dance with them. In so doing, they honor the most basic spiritual and moral principle of the Marana universe, to wit, the faith that the living and the dead are forever joined in a delicate choreography that mutually enlivens them, spanning the seeming divide between visible and invisible worlds in a great dance of life, loss, and regeneration. In other cases, displays of body parts are obscene and vile beyond description, evidence of the absolute worst that humanity is capable of. One thinks immediately of Nazi displays of hair, skin, and teeth extracted from Jewish victims of the Holocaust, of lynchers in this country who proudly posed for photographs next to the mangled and burnt corpses of their innocent African-American victims, or even of a gruesome incident in the history of Atlanta, Georgia. In 1899, the knuckles of the hands of Mr. Sam Hose, an African-American man brutally tortured to death by a white lynch mob, were proudly displayed in the front window of a white-owned butcher shop. How we treat the bodies of the dead is surely a profound mirror into our deepest selves, a privileged window for understanding how we treat our living brothers and sisters. Where then do we place the puzzling works of Gunther von Hagens and Body Worlds 2 along this spectrum? What kinds of mirrors do these plastinates hold up to Dr. von Hagens, to the nature of modern scientific medicine, and to ourselves? To begin with, the phenomenal popularity of these displays holds up a mirror to the institution of the museum itself. Modern museums developed out of Renaissance cabinets of curiosities in which learned gentlemen stored all manner of exotica, ranging from American Indian war clubs to the beak of a parakeet. As historian Stephen Bann has shown, these cabinets emerged during the early Reformation in Protestant Europe, precisely in areas where older medieval Catholic reliquaries storing body parts of martyred saints had been destroyed by Protestant reformers. The Cabinet of Curiosity, and by extension the modern museum, may thus be thought of in a strange way as works of mourning for the lost reliquary, as compensations for the deeply enchanted medieval world, when each worshiper was able to come into intimate physical contact with bodily traces of divine mystery. In that sense, might we say, Body Works recalls for us early origins of the museum system, a time when actual body parts were displayed in the service of profound spiritual transformation. Yet at the same time, the plastinets of body worlds, produced, by the way, by workers in a factory in Dalian, China, holds up a mirror to the profoundly disenchanted nature of our era of secular industrial modernity. No longer do body parts give us glimpses into the mysteries of the divine. Rather, Van Hagen and the Institute insist that the soul has been entirely evacuated from these bodies, that all we are gazing upon is the intricate machinery of nature. I must admit to being a bit suspicious of this claim, to the assertion that we are gazing upon nature, not culture, that we behold in this hall only flesh, not spirit. Van Hagen tells us that he was moved to create posed works of the body art by the popular reaction to his first Body Worlds exhibit in Tokyo, Japan. At the Tokyo show, visitors complained that the corpses in standard anatomical postures, standing upright, made them anxious, and that they looked like ghosts or stiff dolls. The complaint was deeply revealing. In Japan, the souls of unquiet dead who haunt the living are frequently propitiated through the use of dolls. Yet ever since, as Van Hagen has tried consciously to disenchant his plastinets, to render them less ghost-like, he has paradoxically produced entities that are increasingly more uncanny and more disturbing. With each new signed plastinet body, titled and signed, he summons up more of the very spirits of the misty deep that he claims to expel. Rather than a mirror to nature, his works paradoxically hold up a mirror to our troubled modern search for the soul itself. Other mirrors are held up also, including one to normative Western conventions of gender roles and gender relations. We see a male soccer player paired with a female ballerina. In Elegance on Ice, an elevated male ice skater dances with a lowered female skater, her genitalia disturbingly facing the audience. The coherent male thinker sits across from the disturbingly splayed open female head diver. The second assemblage in the show, titled Muscle Man and His Skeleton and a Child, is made to look like a conventional image of a nuclear family. Father first striding forward, then mother with her hand on the small child. This configuration is all the stranger when we realize that the skeleton itself is from the same body as the male muscles. The gendered symbolism is obvious. Muscle, as the active locus of strength, is classified as male, in contrast to the skeleton, which only provides support, which is classified as female. Across the exhibit hall, the pregnant woman with the fetus inside her are carefully set off in a red-draped room, simultaneously evoking both a funeral parlor and a womb. Why are only fetuses granted funereal surroundings? Is it because, since they are not of woman born, they alone are free of original sin? Again, this is hardly simply a mirror of nature, but rather a reflection of very specific cultural systems of gender and power. My reference to mirrors is quite intentional, not simply because we inevitably read each plastinet as a mirror of our own physical beings. Are my lungs that dark, my intestines that lumpy, my penis that big? Beyond this kind of mirroring, I'm struck that Van Hagens has been increasingly drawn to mirror symbolism in the last few years, as he has created ever more spectacular plastinates, physically splitting bodies along various axes of symmetry. Although in some revealing instances that split is not entirely complete. In the flying skier, the male figure is split precisely down the middle, except that his penis, the essence of his maleness, is left demurely intact. These radical divisions put me in mind of the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, who developed the concept of psychic splitting. The immature ego splits the single parental figure into radically good and bad poles in a Manichaean drama of unambiguous good and evil. It's hard not to think of Van Hagen's own biography. Born in 1945, the year of Germany's bloody division, growing up in East Germany, imprisoned in his quest to reach the West. The radically split plastinates produced in the last few years strike me as increasingly neurotic dramatizations of psychic splitting, of an incapacity to realize the ego's reintegration. On this evening, on the eve of Yom Kippur, the sacred Jewish day of atonement and reconciliation, it is worth remembering that on this day, Jews are enjoined not only to seek pardon for themselves, but to seek pardon for souls of the dead. The community of those pardoned, in other words, is all-inclusive, transcending the seeming divide between the living and the dead. As if to express this union, some worshippers even wear the kittel, the white robe in which the dead are buried. It is, I think, precisely this sensibility that is lacking from body worlds. Rather than acknowledging our kinship with the dead, death is denied, as dead bodies are posed as if they were alive, and donors are offered illusions of immortality. The specificity of the dead person, including the circumstances of how he or she died, is obliterated. Our fundamental need to honor the dead, to sort out our commonalities with them and our distinctions from them, becomes impossible. It is for these reasons, I think, that I found body works so nightmarish. But I close my remarks with a dream that we might find a way to mend the wounds inflicted by the pathologist's scalpel, to reintegrate the fractured aspects of the ego, to travel through the looking glass of difference, to reconnect male with female, doctor with patient, the good and the bad, the child and the parent, the living and the dead. In this dream, we do not deny death, nor do we simply gaze upon the dead as if they were alive. Instead, we simultaneously acknowledge that they are dead and that they are nonetheless kin to us. In this dream, like the Marina of Madagascar, we reach out to bring our ancestors for a little while into the light. And then in our grief and perhaps our joy, we embrace the dead and we dance with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, and that's a perfect segue to returning to fortune. We would like to offer you now a unique way to reflect on the breadth of perspectives and issues involved. The Mattatuck Museum, as Maxine and Marie mentioned, commissioned Connecticut Poet Laureate Marilyn Nelson to write a poem about fortune. And we now welcome writer and activist L. Sol Brown to read portions of Fortune's Bones, the Manumission Requiem.
Dinah's Lament. Miss Lydia doesn't clean the doctor room. She says she can't go in that room. She's scared. She make me take the dust rag and the broom and clean around my husband, hanging there. Since she's seen Fortune's head and that big pot, Miss Lydia say that room make her feel ill, sick with the thought of boiling human broth. I wonder how she'd think it'd make me feel. To dust the hands what used to stroke my breast, to dust the arms what hold me when I cried, to dust where his soft lips were and his chest, what curved its warm against my back at night. Through every season, sun up to starlight, I heft, scrub, knead one black woman alone, except for my children, the world so white. Nobody knows my pain but fortune bones. On a Brigador hill. For 50 years, my feeling hands have practiced the bone setter's healing touch, a gift inherited by Porter men. I have manipulated joints, cracked necks, and set my neighbors back to work. I've bled and purged fever and flux, inoculated for smallpox, prescribed fresh air and vegetables, cod liver oil and laudanum, and closed the lightless eyes of the new dead. And I've been humbled by ignorance, humbled by ignorance. Herewith begins my dissection of the former body of my former slave, which served him who served me throughout his life and now serves the advance of science. Note well how death softens the human skin, making it almost transparent, so that under my reverent knife, the first cut takes my breath away. It feels like cutting the whole world. It falls open like bridal gossamer. And I am humbled by ignorance, humbled by ignorance. Standing on a new continent, beyond the boundaries of nakedness, I am forever changed by what I see. The complex, delicate organs fitted perfectly in their shelter of bones. The striated and smooth muscles, the beautiful integuments, the genius strokes of thumb and knee. In profound and awful intimacy, I enter fortune, and he enters me. And I am humbled by ignorance, humbled by ignorance. Not my bones. I was not this body. I was not these bones. This skeleton was just my temporary home. Elementary molecules converged for a breath, then danced on beyond my individual death. And I am not my body. I am not my body. We are brief incarnations. We are clouds in clothes. We are water respirators. We are how Earth knows. I bore light, passed on from an original flame. While it was in my hands, it was called by my name. But I am not my body. I am not my body. You can own a man's body, but you can't own his mind. That's like making a bridle to ride on the wind. I will tell you one thing, and I'll tell you true. Life's the best thing that will happen to you, but you are not your body. You are not your body. You can own someone's body, but the soul runs free. It roams the night sky, mute geometry. You can murder hope. You can pound faith flat, but like weeds and wildflowers, they grow right back. For you are not your body. You are not your body. You are not your body. You are not your bones. What's essential about you is what can't be owned. What's essential in you is your longing to raise your itty-bitty voice in the cosmic praise, for you are not your body. You are not your body. Well, I woke up this morning just so glad to be free, glad to be free, glad to be free. I woke up this morning in a restful peace, for I am not my body. I am not my bones. I am not my body. Glory, hallelujah. I am not my bones. I am not my bones. The last poem, Sanctus. Holy of holies, thy creating name be raised above all barriers. Each and every one of us is fortune for a brief mortal time. Then we are compost. Mother of all holiness, cradle us so we can hear the truth of your heartbeat. Though we have wandered far, call us back home. Eternal source of all identity, call our true names when we forsake our bones. Magnetic center of the universe, make us iron filings. Be to us what south is to autumn geese. Call us home, Lord. Call us home. Call us home, Lord. Set us free.
Thank you. Thank you, Sol. That was beautiful. And I'm Barbara Costa. I'm with the Forum program here at the Museum of Science, and this is a forum portion of this evening's program. And that poem, with all its different perspectives, is a good lead-in to thinking about the different perspectives that we have on this particular subject tonight. Forum program, just by the way, at the museum is about opportunities for conversations among people about the societal implications of science and technology. And we are always exploring different ways to have these conversations so that people can learn and share values with each other, learn from each other, sharing values, priorities, perspectives. And so tonight we're going to try to do something along those lines for the next 30 minutes or so. And in the back of your program, we've got a few questions that we thought you could consider. And we're going to set you up you'll set yourselves up in small groups to talk about them. How do you personally feel about the reverence for the body after death versus the use of human remains for educational purposes and display? What's okay for you and what's not? And do you feel differently about what is acceptable for you as opposed to what you find acceptable for others? Would you honor the wishes of a family member who wants to donate his or her body after death? And finally, where do museums fit in? Is it acceptable to you that bodies are displayed for educational purposes, such as the Body Worlds 2 exhibition? So tonight we'll try to do this together. We can open the curtains. We have chairs set up in the back, and we might reorganize them a little bit. This is just going to be a comfortable way to sit. We could stay where you are, but it'd be easier to gather in groups. And we also have, and no one has to speak if they don't want to, by the way. This is all going to be just what you're comfortable doing. You might just want to listen to others. But we do have some general set of conversation guidelines at the bottom of that, just under where those questions were written. It's pretty common sense, but just to keep in mind, if you would, to speak for yourself, not for others. Remember, all opinions are valid, and each person deserves to speak freely and express his or her feelings, and allow people to complete their thoughts without interrupting them, and be respectful of other people's perspectives and sensitivities. Having said that, in 30 minutes there won't be a lot of time for each of you to talk, but I think it will be an interesting opportunity, given all the ideas that are swirling in our minds right now. We do have some staff facilitators to help in each group, just to encourage people to take time for each other. And just so you know, the goal of this is really just to have the chance to think about the things we've heard and hear what other people think about them. And so at the end of that time, we'll then get back into our seats in this setting, and we'll have an opportunity to have our speakers at the front. We can ask questions of them, or we can also just talk about things that we've been thinking about in the discussion. We can talk about things we heard in our group, or just how we feel ourselves, or, as I say, simply pose questions to the panelists. So at this point, I think it would be, let's just come onto the stage. I think there are 50 chairs up here. I think we have about that many people here, and if there are also chairs at the very back, up at the top. And our facilitators will be in each group, and just get a chance to meet each other briefly and think about some of these questions. And I'll give you a heads up about, and take some water if you'd like. There's water in the bin here if you would like some. And then let's just find some places to sit. Thanks. Because there may be some questions for you, or yes, to these chairs, please. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to hand this microphone over to Monica and Sarah. Where are you? Oh, okay. There you go. Okay, and so Sarah and Monica will bring the microphone over to you if you have any comments or questions. So anybody?
Hi, hello. They discuss. Hello? Yeah, I want to
Hello?
hear what they had to say.
It's okay, I can speak louder. I have a question to the woman that was with the committee down in Waterbury. We heard about Fortune and how you found out about his history, but did you find his family? Is he going back to his family?
Oh no, we didn't find any relatives of his, and the family that he did have after Dr. Porter died. Well, his children were sold before Dr. Porter died, and then his wife was sold after that, and that's all that we know about him at this point. Right. So we have not located any of his descendants at this point.
In Porter's probate record, the Fortune skeleton was valued at $15, and Dinah was valued at $5.
Hi, this question is for George Anas. I was just wondering who oversees who oversees making sure that consent is actually given to exhibits like this, since the public isn't given that information?
Yeah, I mean, the answer to that is no one really does that. The word is that each museum has an expert committee look at this issue. I have no idea what that consists of. England just passed a law influenced by this that says that from now on you have to get a public certificate. You have to give evidence of individual consent and get a public certificate that that's actually true before you can put an exhibit like this on in England. We don't have any laws like that here. So that's all voluntary right now. And also there's this anonymization issue then, and the excuse given for not bringing forth the records is to protect the privacy of the individuals. So that's shouldn't be good enough, right?
And just comments about some of the things they heard in their group, or something that's on their mind that they would put out to everyone or to the panelists, either way?
I think that during the discussion, the beginning part of it, the item that I found most I don't know, either horrifying or ironic was the fact that the skeleton was produced under the concept of ownership of another human being. Despite the first name of the doctor involved, his son didn't see fit to preserve his skeleton. It was only the skeleton of someone that they considered to be property that they would even conceive of doing this about. And I found that to be the most horrifying and disturbing thing.
No, it's a very powerful observation. You're right. Yeah. They were between subject and object, I think, in that sense, right? A slave was an object, really.
I think that is part of what Maxine and the committee were discussing, that Fortune was a man, and he worked on Porter's farm and had a lot of responsibility. His wife, his children, they were all part of that community. And Maxine was saying, something must have happened in that relationship, because we can't accept that there would be that someone would be so cold as to do that to someone they knew, and knew the family, and the family were part of his household. So yeah, but he was property.
Well, I'd like to ask the panel, when is the display of human remains appropriate in a museum setting? And I'm thinking about not only science museums, but art museums, history museums. Do different guidelines apply to different kinds of museums? And also, and then what is it about American culture that makes it more likely to accept certain types of displays, parts, bones, and mummies, perhaps? I think you did talk about, George, you talked about age of things, and not others. I mean, the whole body specimens. Is there something about the American culture that accepts some things more readily than others?
Well, human remains are displayed in science museums and natural history museums. I think the issue we're a region of industrial history. We have a lot of machines in our exhibits. So the issue of displaying Fortunes, they were on display, they were removed from display in 1970. In fact, we never discussed displaying Fortune's remains again in the museum. The issue that has been confronted by the committee and over which there is much discussion is the issue of whether or not Fortune's remains should be buried. But in fact, there are people who believe that those remains should be displayed, and they believe that because what can be denied, which is the horror of slavery, and that even there seems to be a belief that Northern slavery wasn't so bad. And what can't be denied is the evidence in the bones. So that's why there's a desire to not only preserve those bones, but on the part of some people to actually display them.
I think there. Yeah, please go ahead.
I want to say that in Waterbury, the 4th and 5th graders, all their teachers have allowed them to come down to see the Pepper's Ghost, we call that, which is the computer version of Fortune, and see his computer version of his skeleton, and then how he looked as after the forensic artists got through with him and so forth. But I work in the school system, and the children, when they return to school, were very fascinated by the whole thing. But in today's age, and this is how kids feel, in today's age, they were really expecting to see real bones. And so some of them were disappointed. They thought they were, I mean, they like scary things. So they were disappointed. They wanted to see real bones, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment quickly on two things. I think that this question of authenticity is terrifically important that was raised in the course, I think, of all the remarks today. that these are in the body world's real. They're not plastic. The voyeuristic qualities, I think, of finding oneself a couple of inches away from these plastinated corpses, which I think therein lies another story, the avoidance of the term corpse, even of body, of referring to these as plastinates and as works of art. And the work of art in this context, in the frame of a science museum, I think also bears some conversation. What does it mean that we're looking at these corpses in a science museum versus an art museum? Could it happen in an art museum? Could we see this at the MFA? And how does the overall context of display in this case, change how we see these objects?
What is the policy? What is the policy for of identity of the remains, and if you do, how do you reconcile that in identifying it to the public?
Just a point of clarification. What remains are you talking about?
When you have a display of that person, that personhood, and that personhood is now, this body is there in display. Now, what is your policy as far as identifying that to the public?
Identifying that
identifying the personhood, the person who it belonged to.
That's all. The remains, the Fortune's bones are not on display. But his whole story is told in a museum exhibit. His whole story, his identity, his history, everything and more than we've told you tonight. And the museum's role in all of that as well, that the bones were given to the museum in the 1930s. And actually, the bones were never articulated into a skeleton. The poet takes license with the dinahs dusting the bones. It was the museum that had the bones articulated into a skeleton and put them on display in the 1950s. And they remained on display until the 1970s. And then, out of community sensitivity to the community, they were taken off display and then remained in storage until the issue was brought to the African American History Project Committee of helping us find out who he really was and what happened to him.
Thanks. Hearing all these questions, and especially the poem, made me think that the issue of slavery is central to everything about this particular exhibition in this museum, the body worlds. I mean, Van Huggins talks about, he's inspired by the Renaissance and speaks of the Renaissance as a period of great discovery and so forth, but it's also the period historically that was the foundation of the global slave trade. And I feel that more and more that the shadow of slavery, of the greatest sin in our country, hangs over this exhibition, and that's, to me, one of the things that makes it so disturbing. And after all, Marilyn Nelson's poem, when she spoke about standing on a new continent, I mean, that the relationship of discovery and the relationship of the slave owner feeling the absolute right to control and open up another person's body, that's a very powerful connection. And these issues of anonymity that you just asked about identity and the denial of full personhood, that seems in a strange way to run through a lot of the Body World show as well. So in a strange way, what's being held up for us, and what some of the debates that we're still asking about, who owns a person during and after life, can people or dead people be sold, this just shows that the great crises of slavery, which we thought were far beyond us, are those that we still live with and struggle with every day.
I'd like to go back to the question that this gentleman asked earlier, and one of the questions I think that your issue raises is who speaks for Fortune, and basically I think that we're his family now, and if his descendants don't come forward, we are his family. The African American History Project Committee speaks for Fortune with the museum.
Yeah, but the committee also feels that, prior to our committee, that Fortune was in storage, really, and I personally feel that the storage that he was in all these many years was his grave, and that we, the committee, decided to really open up his grave and bring him forward again. So now this is why we are now have taken on maybe a bigger responsibility than we ever anticipated by bringing Fortune back. And now we have the responsibility of deciding what to do with him. And at this point, before this point, it was already decided what to do with him, which was nothing but leave him in the storage. So now we're faced with a bigger responsibility than what we ever anticipated.
Just to acknowledge something of the Fortune story and kind of bringing it to today is that, you were just saying how Fortune's family is now you. The interesting thing is that many of the plastinates right now currently have lost their identities. They're now anonymous. However, they do have living family relatives very alive. And I just wanted to bring that out, that's a very interesting theory. So I guess Dr. Von Hagen is building up his family.
In my opinion, this is all an issue of human superiority. Like, we believe that we're above other organisms. In other words, it's like I'm sure many of you are aware that there were 2 camels and a horse at the exhibit, and that hasn't been a part of the conversation at all. So, I mean, why are we as humans so much better in our minds than any other animal on this planet?
Or I guess
as far as the slaves are concerned, they weren't considered 100% human in the first place. So they felt that anything could be done to slaves also, because they also were not considered 100% human.
Yeah, I wasn't focusing as much on the slaves as the bioethical issue here, because I understand that in the past slaves were obviously inferior, which is incredibly unfortunate. Like in Frederick Douglass's narrative of Slave, he spoke about one of his co-slaves, I suppose that would be the word, being shot and then left in a river. So, I mean, it was all unfortunate then, but I'm focusing more on the plastination issue. Yeah, I mean, why aren't the camels and the horse in the first Body Worlds exhibit being discussed? Because do we see that we're better than those organisms?
I think that's a reasonable question. I don't know. I think the answer is yes, we do think we're better than those organisms. But the other answer is that humans do have this history of burying their dead and caring for their dead, and animals really don't. Some do, but I mean, as a general matter, camels don't, but as far as I know, and horses don't. Those are the 2 that have been plastinated. But it is striking, and what the real question is, what the hell are the animals doing in the middle of this human exhibit? That's a good question. That's a really good question.
And I guess partially in response to your question, it did strike me as noteworthy that the camel's head is split into three pieces. So when I first saw the camel, you're looking at these 3 slices of the neck and the head, and it looked to me like sort of fantastical objects that would have ended up in a cabinet of curiosity a couple of hundred years ago. In other words, the strange, the weird, the deformed, what he's done to both animal and human bodies is, in essence, I think, to produce the strange. And I think that bears some thought.
Yeah, I'm an exhibit planner here at the museum. I'm intensely interested in your question about animals and how they're displayed here and what's the difference. I'm a zoologist myself, so I feel very much the way you do. And, there have been controversies about that, even here at the museum. So if you go to our fox diorama, for instance, that was produced, I think it was late 50s, early 60s. I didn't work here then. But those foxes were brought in here, the young kits, the babies, were brought in here by a trapper. And people who worked here at the museum would go down to the Live Animal Center and play with the fox kits. And then when the diorama was first opened, and people who worked here realized that it was the same kits that they played with that were in that diorama, they were completely outraged. It was a huge controversy just within the staff here at the museum. So for me as an animal lover, the issues are very much the same.
Well, it sounds like there's a theme of power throughout, and I wonder if power was somehow, if people absolutely could say that this is their desire to be displayed in this way, does that remove a lot of the issues for people, or just a question? But anyway, anyone else can either answer it or just pose your own.
I want to discuss the idea. We've discussed ownership. I would like to discuss the idea of the gaze and how we've conceptualized this as education. But part of education is gazing upon something and owning it. And I don't quite know how to reconcile those things because, for example, we have a history of dissecting people. Sarah Bartman, for example, was exhibited, and then when she died, she was dissected and exhibited. And I don't know if it's a question of what is the line, or how do we as people take into ourselves others? And how are we creating this as we do it? Does that make sense? Can any of you speak to that?
I think one possible response here is I'm reminded of the painting by Rembrandt, I believe, of the anatomy lesson, which is actually featured towards the end of the Body Worlds exhibit. And for me, the striking thing about that painting is that and this has been certainly theorized by others along these lines, that the gaze of all of the people gathered around the corpse is directed towards each other, and especially to the attending physician who is instructing the anatomy lesson. Yes, to the text and to the physician as they hold it, attempting then to find what they are sure exists in the text, in the body. And I think there's a displacement in some very interesting way of the sources of authority, that it's no longer, in that sense, our bodies that we own, and we all know this in certain contexts from engagements with sitting in a doctor's office. You're no longer asked precisely in so many words, where does it hurt? But you're asked to give symptoms, which then the doctor interprets. And a displacement in that context of authority from the body to the text, to the physician. I'm not quite sure how that works in the context of Body Worlds, but I think he is certainly, Von Hagen is certainly exercising his overarching engagement with the mastery of these corpses in the way they're displayed and indeed cut. So it's, I think, on a related plane.
We're close to 9 o'clock, but why don't we take another one or two comments that, thank you.
Just as a comment, I believe at the time that painting was made, the thought of sight or gaze was that it came from the person, went out into the world, and came back. So that actually what those observers were doing was touching the scene in front of them. They had an actual contact with it rather than this was something passively where light came into your eye. And this was actually an active participation with the scene on the part of the observer.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to mention that there are a lot of issues that have come up. There will be 2 more forums inspired by the Body Worlds exhibition that we will be holding, one on organ donation, looking at supply and demand and ethical issues, black market, on October 24th, and another one about looking at a variety of cultural and religious perspectives about bodies after death. That will be on November 14th, November 14th. And you can check the website, the forum website, for more information.
So I just want to thank our panelists who've just been so amazing in covering all of the various complexities of these issues. So thank you.
And to everyone for participating in this experiment as well tonight. Thank you.
And I wanted to just thank you for joining us. The program was an experiment for us in format, and we hope you'll let us know whether it was successful for you. There were surveys on your chair, so we hope you'll take a moment to fill them out, and there will be staff people at the exit collecting them. And that'll let us know, great feedback from what you think. And also, copies of the beautiful poem and the beautiful book of Fortune's Bones, The Manumission Requiem, are available for sale right outside the door right now, if you would like to purchase a copy or at least see the book. And we hope that you enjoyed our program. It was endlessly fascinating. And thank you all for joining us. Good night.